Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here with another Product Growth Leaders Product Conversations. Steve, when we're working with clients, we often, we'll get some of the junior product managers asking, how do I climb the organization, or even senior product managers struggling with working with the senior leadership. And based on that, we started thinking that maybe we should be having a conversation on this. We should have a conversation on managing up. And so I'll give May credit for coming up with this idea a couple of weeks ago. You've been in product management longer than, anybody I know. How has managing up been something that you remember, that you've used, or how reviews advised people on?
Well, I think in my experience, there's two kinds of conversations that happen with managing up: the things that you say and the things you wish you had said. I had a case years ago where the president said development is broken and you need to fix it. And I went and talked to development, came back a week later and said to the president, I found the problem. It's you. You need to shut the hell up for 5 minutes, And I said that in my head, right? And what I said out loud was, they've got a full plate. I'll tell you what, you come to me with your ideas and then I'll prioritize them and put them on the backlog and, whatever. I did it diplomatically. But, my first reaction was, don't say the first thing that comes into your head.
It's so true. I mean, although sometimes I've seen leadership appreciate the candidness some people have, especially in a place where it's yes. So we've decided, what a great topic. May is starting to take over my editorial calendar for me, coming up with ideas. May, I'm going to give you a chance. Any thoughts you want before we kick into the Monday question? Why was this something you thought was important?
Because it comes up in every single conversation, right? Like, I've been talking to a lot of product people, and almost all of them talk about the struggles within their organization. But it's not necessarily a struggle, because sometimes it's healthy organizations but they're saying, like, there's this disconnect between what they feel like their job is and what leadership wants from them. So I think it's worth a conversation, especially for people working in product, because we often find ourselves in this dilemma.
No, completely and totally. So we've put, in addition to May, Steve, and myself, we put a great panel together for this topic. Richard Samela, Stacey Feero, Marlon Davis. Stacey, we'll work with kid gloves to start. But as I was saying in the green room, we tend to not pull any punches. But this is Stacey's first time here. But from what May's told me, I think you're going to fit right in. So on Monday, we put the question in on LinkedIn. What are the keys for product managers and product leaders to successfully manage up? And Richard, you've been writing some on this. Maybe it's your lessons learned from not properly managing up. But I wanted to give you a chance to, what are the keys to successfully manage up?
I mean, it's really understanding who you're managing up to and what their expectations are. I've had great success managing up when I've had leaders who have trust in the people that they employ, right? So when you're managing up with those people, you give them the details and a shared notebook of what you're going to talk about. They read everything ahead of time. They put their questions in there so you can prepare, and you end up with these great conversations. When you're working with a micromanager or someone who has to have all the control, managing up will blow up in your face quicker than lighting a match, because that person is going to see it as you are trying to, be a bully. You are trying to, push your will, your way of working on them, and they will resist it to their detriment.
I mean, it's almost product management, right? Who's
right.
Who's the persona? What's the problem you're solving with them? And in some cases, the problem you're solving is not getting the best work done. It's feeding their ego or their control or whatever it may be. It's interesting how often these conversations, and maybe managing up, it makes sense for it, but it comes out a lot of places, all come back to that psychological safety aspect. It changes everything if you have it. But it seems like that and curiosity seem to keep coming back and coming back and coming back into our conversations. Stacey, what do you think? What are the keys for product managers and leaders to successfully manage up?
So I think you're right, Grant, when you said like curiosity keeps coming up and problem solving keeps coming up. So I hate the phrase managing up. The bullshit fucking, like, sorry, I don't know if I can swear. Sorry.
I think I have, but you know, you're fitting right in. So I may not do that as the pull quote, but
it is the worst phrase, because you know what it tells people, and especially like you mentioned at the beginning, like, you know, when you're working with your clients and you've got junior product people, they're like, how do I do this? How do I manage up? And it means like they think I have to puff up and exemplify bravado to the CEO or the president who doesn't realize his own mistakes. And what you actually need to do is apply the same skill set you apply to your customer, which is, yeah, what problem am I solving for you? And ask a lot of questions and tackle it with curiosity. Like it takes a lot of I think self-awareness on the individual product manager or product leader to ask the questions you need of the people who sign your paycheck in order to do your job effectively. And that's a scary thing to do. But I think it all comes back down to that, like being curious and understanding their position.
A couple of things that just came from that in my head. First, managing up, I think, does have in my head, the negative connotation of managing up means you're sacrificing your peers and managing down only to manage up, right?
That's the leader's conundrum, I find.
So you've got this person who they know exactly how to talk to leadership. They're comfortable talking to leadership, and all of the leaders love them, and all their coworkers hate them, because it's like they're, it's tough, and it does have a negative connotation. But that being said, this goes to both Richard and Stacey's comments. It's all depending on what environment you're in. So managing up sometimes is a true trusting collaborative thing. And sometimes managing up is a protecting your job until you can find the next one where it comes. Marlon, I'd love to get your first take on the question. What are the keys to doing it successfully?
So I'm going to take managing up, managing down, and say manage in both directions, right? Because to Rich's point, to be able to even have that line of communication, you need to have a good trusting environment between, if you're the head of product in this situation, you need to have a good relationship with those who are below you. And they need to have clear parameters around what it is that you guys are doing operationally, so that communication can make its way up to you. And there needs to be established lines of communication, informally and formally. Do you meet in one-on-ones? Do you know what's happening? So I when I hear managing up to, from Stacey's perspective, I hear a lot of onus being put on those below, as opposed to what is the onus that needs to be put on the leadership to make sure that environment is in place, so that communicate, what you really want is good communication happening at each level, so that everyone's flank is protected. No surprises are popping up, right? So nothing has gone on for 2 months that, if it had been identified a month and a half earlier, could have been addressed and everything could have been smooth, right? But if there's not a good relationship, there's not a good environment, there's not a good trust there's not good lines of communication, that's impossible. So a little bit of the onus, or maybe a good lion's share of the proportion of the ownership, should be on leadership, to make that environment.
I'm going to dig in on that question. I'm going to ask it to you first, Marlon. As a product leader, right, what is your role, right, to help your people? You talked about managing up and managing down. How do you do that?
I'm going to put this really plain. They need to understand what time it is. Just like that. They need to, a lot of organizations that I've been, a lead in terms of leading product, have been private equity. So my conversation even starts in hiring and recruiting. this is an up-tempo environment. Just telling you right up front, we run, we don't jog, we don't walk. So I start that whole relationship around, here's what time it is, here's the environment you're getting into, here's what I'm doing to make it work for all of us so that we can get to the objectives that the company needs. I start that right in recruiting.
Mm-hmm. Set the expectations day one.
Set the expectations. Here's how we're going to work together.
Awesome. May, we'll go back to the Monday question because I'm going to get to the product leader question later in a different form. What are the keys to doing it successfully, and maybe without the negative connotation that Stacey mentioned?
So let's talk about why we feel this negative connotation, right? The time that this conversation comes up is when we're struggling. It's when there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of direction. Maybe the directions are changing all the time. Maybe it's micromanagement, whatever it might be. That's the time when we talk about it. But in reality, like, I think all of you have been product leaders. So you've experienced the like the gauntlet that is product leadership. You have very little time to do a lot of the things that you want to do, and a lot of the times like things slip by. You don't have the time to really build that stronger product culture, build that tight relationship. And so, like, the questions that we might be able to ask, as maybe not someone directly at the top, is, what can I do to make this an effective working relationship? Right. And it's a little too late when you have to talk about managing up. Uh, it never
That's a
comes.
great point.
It never comes up early enough for us to really have that conversation early, in an effective way, in a way that like impacts our work today. It always gets to be a little too bad by the time we have that conversation. So I talk to a lot of people who are like aspiring to be product leaders because they've been in these terrible situations where they feel like they can't do their job. And so the only way to be able to do what they think product management should be is to get into that position of leadership where the cycle perpetuates itself because you find yourself overwhelmed once again, because when you're in a position of product leadership, you might not be able to call the shots still. Maybe there's an acquisition coming through. Maybe it's like year 5 of a PE acquisition and they're trying to sell the company. Whatever it might be, there's a lot of different factors at play here, and that constrains what you're able to do. So I think like instead of talking about managing up, it could be a conversation about like what is your relationship with the leader or with your manager.
Shift the sort of the lens of it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Steve, one of my inspirations for this, when we had Rich on a couple months ago, Rich Mirnoff. He talked about the importance of being able to speak to the boardroom, right? You can't expect to succeed as a product manager or product leader if you can't communicate with the leadership team and board. I'd love to get your take. We've talked about some of the other stuff. How much is managing up being able to do that? You're on mute. There's this great button called the mute me that I'll introduce you to.
I think everybody has said this in different ways, that managing up is really a phrase of frustration, that, I haven't built this relationship with somebody above me. And so I'm having to have this difficult conversation, and I don't quite know how to do it. And I think Rich Mirnoff's point a few weeks ago was spot on. It's like we a lot of times, product management and development talks in their own language. Let's talk about infrastructure, or let's talk about stories, or let's talk about things on the roadmap, and the leadership wants to hear, how is this going to move the needle? How is this going to increase sales, or how is this going to increase adoptions? So I think I guess the main thing is in as we've all said in different forms, building that relationship with the people above you, beside you, and below you, so that we can have honest conversations before we have a conflict.
I love that. Like, question just popped into my head. I mean, I think it's in the aggregation of everything we're saying here. How important is managing sideways to managing up?
Oh,
and what I mean by that is, right,
I know you
I'm
want to
working
go
with.
Go ahead.
What, Steve? I was going to give context.
I was just going to say, I think it is equally important to manage sideways. I had a ropes course years ago as one of those ridiculous offsite things where management learns to play well together. And my CTO turned to me and said, hey, you know, I will catch you if you fall, but I will also destroy you tomorrow if I have the chance. So, you know, building those relationships side to side is maybe even more important than building up and down.
Because where my head was going with this is, I spend more time with when I was a product manager, I spent more time with the tech lead working on my product than I did with the CTO. I spent more time with the finance manager, FP&A person than I did with the CFO. And so this is maybe my answer to successfully managing up, is successfully managing sideways, right? Because when I went into a meeting and I said something, the CFO went to the FP&A person and said, what do you know about this Grant guy? I wanted him to, his feedback on me was just as important to me establishing that relationship as it was anything else. Richard, what do you think?
So I was going to say, one, let's make sure we're all talking the same thing when we talk about managing up, right?
Yep.
Me, when I'm talking managing up, I'm talking about proactively understanding the information my manager needs to give to their manager, and getting that to them ahead of time to facilitate their conversations with their manager and to help facilitate my conversation with my manager.
Yep.
Right. And doing so by setting, boundaries of how we're going to share information back and forth. Right. So when I manage up, that's my goal for managing up. It's not necessarily a power play. It's not to take control of a situation. It's to facilitate information and set expectations on how it's going to be shared.
And so so managing up is managing expectations of your manager and helping them manage the expectations of their manager.
Exactly.
And if everything works well, it flows through
It flows through. And this goes the same sideways, right? Because you're working with people who are working on other teams who have to do the same thing with their managers.
Yep.
Right. And so you're doing that same thing. Preferably, right, if you're a leader, right, you're changing your communication style to support the individuals that report into you, instead of having those individuals adapt their communication style to yours. But sideways, it really goes both ways. And managing down, right, you're adapting your communication style to the people who are reporting up into you and giving information to you, because that's what makes communication flow easier. That's what helps build trust across an organization, is being able to adapt to the people around you. So, right, when I say managing up, this is what I'm talking about, which is why, right, it comes back to when you're dealing with those micromanagers, they struggle with it because a micromanager, they want everything their way, right? And they want to be in control of everything, and they want it not when you want to give it to them, right? They may not want it written down or put in a notebook. They may want to get into a meeting and you just tell it to them in the meeting for the first half of the meeting, and then they spend the second half of the meeting giving you a whole nother list of things to do which of course doesn't make for a great meeting because all of that could have been an email.
No,
That's-
completely. May, you're going to say something?
One aspect of managing up is just like, I think it's also not the direct up. There's also, you got to manage the head of sales, head of operations, whatever it might be, or like the C-suite board. I think at some point in time, they're all up. So in a way, I think this conversation, like, is it the same as talking about stakeholder management, up, down, and sideways, or is it different? Like, I'm not sure.
So is managing up or managing sideways just stakeholder management? Or is it the negative connotation of managing up that makes it different than stakeholder management?
Define stakeholder management.
I don't know. It's just the bucket that I throw everything in anytime someone asks for like a list of topics. So
Well, clarity is kindness, right? Like we're having this debate. So like Richard got us on this train of being like, are we all on the same page talking about the same thing, right? And so like I personally bucket in stakeholder management because I think it's a skill. It means, are you building relationships? Are you communicating effectively? Are you able to bring people along the journey? Like to Richard's point, he's like, you were saying it's about communication and facilitation. However, I think when you talk about getting people to follow you along the journey of where the product is going, which is really your job, product manager level to CPO, right? And there's a phrase I love to use, I stole from an old boss of mine, and it's facipulation. I facilitate through sort of manipulation tactics. Some of our job is that. Manipulation has such a pejorative connotation that people are like, I don't want to admit that I do that, but you 100% do that, right? Because like the best way to build your relationships up, down, and across is building a personal bond and understanding what they need in their role to be successful. And then you help make that happen. It's not a like one-way transactional because you have that knowledge, you're able to execute on the vision you ultimately have for the product. And you're serving the greater good of customers and the business. And that's what we're hired to do. So it's all like
shouldn't that be the easiest thing? How do you manage up successfully? Take care of the customers and the business.
No, because humans are messy, right? Like humans are messy. Like that's like if it was that easy, like we'd be cakewalking. I often teach junior PMs like the craft of product management. And one of the things I always say to them, I'm like, if you could apply a framework or a tool or an adage, whatever practice, and it just always worked, we'd be making money hand over fist and never have to worry about anything in life, right? Yeah. Like success is not a straightforward path. If it was, we would all be successful. And depending on the humans you're playing with, you may not always be successful.
I really love that term, depending on the humans you're playing with, because it is a mess. It can get messy.
Yeah, I just want to jump right. I worked with someone who felt it was more important to make them happy than to achieve the goals of the product.
That's the messy.
And that's the messy.
And that sucks as a situation to be in.
Not the soccer player messy, but
yeah,
the dirty messy. Marlon, we've sort of like jumped 3 or 4 topics since I first said I wanted to talk about going cross managing sideways. Managing sideways, the messy, people are the problem, stakeholders, and what does that mean? You know, any thoughts on where's your head on where we've been going with this? Because it's sort of been going a little windy.
Well, let me summarize what I've heard so far, which is some of the managing up is just managing relationships, right? Which I agree completely with Stacey. It's all about managing those relationships. And the lower you are or the higher you are, the more you realize you have to do it, the higher you go, right? It becomes a realization. The other piece of this is clear communication and clear lines of communication to be established, like whether they're informal or formal. As a leader, that you put those out there and those expectations are made. I'm going to say add a third thing here that we haven't talked about is context, which is when I was a product manager versus being the head of product and talking to a board on a quarterly basis, or let's just say on a quarterly basis, the conversations are different, right? The conversations are usually at a board level. Hey, how are things going? Give us the state of the union. Are we making our way towards our goals? When you're in a quarterly board meeting, it is not about what is operationally happening, to be quite honest. That conversation probably happened already, depending upon if it's PE or VC backed or whatever organization you're in, that they have some liaisons that have been working with you, like MHC and another one, Vista Equity Partners, employs the same framework where you have people who are in that organization who are just CTOs or CPOs for the private equity that work with the portfolio of product leaders and technical leaders and marketing leaders. And you work operationally through problem solving and through other things. Those are your opportunities to manage up and to have that narrative get constructed with those guys. By the time you make it to a board meeting, you're not having a surprise moment conversation. That is absolutely
the board meeting is the last
guaranteed to
place
be
you want to have any
included.
surprises.
Yeah, you might as well pack up the next day. So managing up happens to be about what information you're sharing, how you're sharing it, at what level that you need to provide it, and what have you already sorted out, as you go, higher and higher up the levels. When I'm talking to those who report into me or lower, it's all about what's happening operationally speaking that I need to be aware of that will cancel our plans, that we need to have some mitigation efforts for, and we need to address it now so that we stay on course with what our roadmap is, what our vision is. That's the kind of communication and context for a conversation I want to have with my overall team, right? One-on-one meetings, let's just have whatever conversation we're going to have about relationship building, because we need to have that kind of bond. When I'm in the foxhole, I want to know the other 4 people around me. I want to know who they are and where their strengths are so that we can actually get after the mission. That's the relationship building that needs to be conducted by the leader. Now, is it something that the person beneath you has to do? Sure, they need to be communicative, they need to talk, but it really needs to be step 2 by the leader in that foxhole. Here's my team. Who do I have? I got Kowalski, I got Hines, sharpshooter, hand to hand. Okay, what do they like? He likes popsicles. She likes pork chops. I know these people. We're going to war. We're getting along the pathway to getting after the mission. And so information should be flowing up to me if I've facilitated those relationships so that I can have leeway and a line of sight to get ready for board conversations.
It's interesting because that just added the other dimension, right? Managing down or managing your people, because part of successfully managing up, and I found this is one of my keys to successfully managing up when I was a product leader was making sure my product managers, whenever they interacted with senior leadership, were on point, right?
Yes.
They were crisp, they were concise, they knew what they were talking about, they didn't wander. And, but to your point also, it's also, you have to build that relationship. The easiest way as a product leader to lose credibility managing up is the unexpected, right?
Yes. Oh,
and
yeah.
so you need your team, as a product leader, you need your team to be part of your managing up, because not just making sure that they represent your organization well, which represents well in you, but to make sure that they realize that they're not going to leave you hanging high and dry, right? They're not,
Right.
I love that aspect of it. I'm going to move on to the second question in a second. Any other thoughts on keys for successfully managing up before we go to some of the other questions? All right.
Well, I think there's also really, let's talk about why do we manage up. So the way I put it, a product leader has 5 buckets of jobs, 4 or 5 jobs. And the first one is, of course, people management. Then you have your product strategy of what you oversee, or portfolio strategy. Then you've got stakeholder management, up, down, and sideways, relationship building, whatever that might be. And then you have the layer above you. So the strategy of the portfolio or the organization or the company or whatever it might be at that level. And half the time, the product leader is also the one setting that strategy, or at least heavily, heavily influencing that strategy. And the last one's how does your team work together, which is kind of more of what I focus on. But what I found is that, like, a lot of product leaders' time is spent in the product strategy below and making sure it's aligned with the upper strategy and like setting that strategy. And in a way, like, aside from building those relationships with stakeholder management, you also have like th- they're they're um they're pretty important nuances in and of itself, covered in those 3 buckets, but they are also very different forms of work. And I think, like, we can't just strip out like the context, right? Like, as Marlon said, it's about the context of what you're managing up, but also it's making sure there's that really super clear alignment between how your team is relevant and also how it's all tied together with your peers within that organization, through that higher level strategy.
I love that. Again, so many layers to think about.
I was just,
Go
so
ahead.
just one, I think that ties me to what Marlon was saying, right? Around like the context. In my
Yep.
mind, like the context is like, what's the vision for the company? Where is the company headed strategically in 1 to 3 years? And then how does your team's roadmap ladder up to support that? Because that's what you mean by those levels of strategy. You're like, what's the vision? What's the strategy over the next longer term? What's the shorter term strategy in my portfolio?
I would say there's a little bit more than just laddering up, because it's like laddering up and then alignment with your peers with that ladder. I think that's like the added thing.
Yeah. I love it. Well,
Yeah,
it's sort of. Go ahead, Marlon.
I was just gonna second that what May just said. Oops, sorry here. One of my best teams that I've ever had with that. I'm getting an echo here. I think I should stop talking.
All right.
Go ahead.
No, it's gone.
Oh, okay, awesome. It's gone. What I was gonna say here in with May is one of the I've had great relationships with all the senior leaders that I've worked with at these companies, but some stand out more than others. And to May's point, you do a lot of sideways work too. One group of senior leaders, we still get together, even though we're all on different missions now. But we worked that well together. We were that aligned together that we appreciated working with each other, that we still to this day get together and see what's going on with one another. So you do have to foster sideways relationships. Let's be real, they're in a foxhole too. The whole company is in a foxhole. It's just you have different relationships with different people, and everybody's trying to get this mission happen. So that's it. That was the only thing I was trying to say before the feedback started hitting me.
No worries. I get it. And I think you're lucky if you can once in your career have a team like that you work with, that you can keep in touch with. And that makes me think about some of the ones I've been on. What's the hardest thing about managing up?
For me, it's building relationships with people that I think I'm like very fundamentally misaligned with. Like, you can't find that bond thing right away, and you have to dig a lot deeper or find connection in your differences, because the differences I find are often quite valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I don't immediately click with someone, it's a partner or a leader that I'll ultimately, time will tell, is a great relationship, because we see things from different perspectives, and you create magic when you've got different perspectives. But I find it hard building that initial bond.
It's interesting, Stacey, because I'm looking at my career history. It's like the teams that probably did the worst were the ones that were like mirror images of each other.
Yeah.
Were the teams that had diversity in them, which may have been harder to initially get to work, are the ones where magic happened. And so maybe that's just my comment on yours saying, God, it's so important to put that extra work in if you don't do it initially.
That's exactly what I meant. I think that's the hardest thing, is getting over that hump and pushing yourself to build that relationship. Because like May, you brought this up earlier in our conversation. You're like, if you're managing up, you're in a reactive moment. And building the relationship, especially if there's not an initial like kismet, is the preventative medicine, if you will, to avoid having to react that way later on, because you see each other as humans, and therefore when you're when you're at odds and you're combative around a decision, a direction the product is going, the company is headed, you can have that conversation more effectively if you see each other as equals or partners.
It was interesting. I was working on an acquisition at a company I was at 20 some years ago, and the president of the division said, we were going down there for a due diligence trip, and the president of the division said, whatever you need to do, get this deal done. And the CFO had basically, the CFO of the main company said, I don't like this thing, let's make sure it clears all the hurdles. And he and I had been managing up to the divisional president very well, but I hadn't been managing up to the CFOs very well. And we got into some arguments and some fights, and I delivered the business plan for the acquisition, and the CFO came to me and said, I'm glad we had the interactions we had, and I want to go buy you a drink because you just built one of the best business plans I've ever seen. And sometimes you need to Marlon's term, be in the foxhole with somebody and go through it. And I'll be honest, before he came to me, I'm like, I never want to work with that CFO again, right? It was a bad situation, but he came and he actually, so sometimes going through those experiences are how you can come together with where you want to go. Richard, what do you think? What's the hardest thing?
Hardest thing is when it goes wrong.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, 95% of the time, I found managing up, managing sideways, managing down very easy, right? Because I don't wait for things to go wrong. I'm very proactive. Once I start someplace, right, that's when I start building, this is how I want to set up our communication channels.
Yeah.
And then it works great. It's those little times where you hit that resistance and that other person is just like, no, just give it to me when I ask for it. And never any other time that you run into challenges, because you may not have those answers on the fly.
Yeah. No, I think for me, the hardest times for me are when the person you're managing up to is closed-minded, fixed mindset, and what they're asking for doesn't align with my views of what's the best way to do something. And I know you've been through some of this, and it's tough. I mean, those are the hardest times, and where you get those questions like, should I even stay? Just because you can't change somebody. It's almost the counter to the story I shared earlier. Marlon, what about you? Hardest things about managing up?
I think Stacey already nailed it in terms of relationships. Like ultimately, at the end of the day, these are all relationships. And Grant, you just touched on it. Do we have a good working relationship, and should we stay in this marriage together? Right? Ultimately, you don't want to get to that particular point, so you have to proactively manage those relationships. I think the second thing that I will add to this that I had to learn the hard way, if this particular skill set was a bunch of branches in a forest, low-hanging branches, I think I ran into every last one of them in that forest, which is being able to communicate upwards in situational communications, especially the higher I got. where it came more about just give me the facts, give me the narrative, be able to weave a good narrative. That communication style, when it comes to managing up, is something that I had to actually just watch, get bloodied to figure out how to do that. Because some of these situations when you're lower, it's just give me the details, give me the facts. When you're a product manager and you're telling your VP or you're telling your director, hey, heads up, that's sufficient. Give me all the details. When you make it to having a conversation with, the rest of your senior leadership group, or you're talking to the board, the chairman of the board, very specific, you need brevity, you need to be tight, you need to be right on point with the narrative of what it is that you're trying to tell them. So managing up goes into all different kinds of situational communication forms. And that one was the hardest for me to learn.
Yeah, I love it. Meg, hardest thing.
One of the things I learned from Compass is the thing they use when they sell is they ask one question, which is what's important to you. And in all of these conversations, we're talking about we need to know what's important to the person we're talking to. Which is, like, for someone lower down, it's often like, what am I supposed to be doing? Or someone more junior trying to figure things out, like, can I get some direction? Who can I get help from? Can I get it's that granular piece. But sometimes someone higher up, like, they want some level of granularity, some level of like detail, but it's really important to find out what they care about. And kind of corollary to that, but slightly different, is that they probably don't understand what it is that you do, right?
Yeah.
What is product management, going back to that role clarity? Because they, like, oftentimes I find that they don't know how to respond to you because they don't know what it is that you do. And that I think is one of the most important work of a product leader, to basically help people understand what it is that the product management function and therefore your team does, and the value that you bring. Um, and it gets even more challenging as it evolves over time.
Yeah, no, completely. In understanding that, many people miss that. Steve, hardest thing, managing up.
I think for me, the hardest thing is goal alignment. I often, I'm well known for having conflict with sales, in that I want the salespeople to sell what we have to people who need it. And many sales teams want to sell whatever they can think of, because after all, software is easy. And I can't blame the sales guy, right? I have to blame the VP of sales. He's like, we're not aligned on goals, right? And I worked for this brilliant president who we agreed we were going to focus entirely on a specific market segment. And Kevin, the world's worst salesperson, said, well, hey, I'm trying to sell something right now to this other company. And the president said, oh, well, that's okay. Good luck on that. Maybe you can close it, but I won't be paying commissions unless it's in our target market. And, that was like the first time I ever really understood what it was like to be aligned with somebody. And of course, Kevin was very unhappy about it, but strangely, we did not ever close that deal, since, of course, he wasn't going to get paid on it.
Well, and I think for product, the number of times I've heard stories, the number of times I've been in this situation, new products being launched and you can't get sales support. This is a place where managing up is actually so important, because, being able to have a leader or a president in your case who makes that hard decision to say, we're only paying, we're making our commission structure such that we only comp the deals we want. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can count on more than one hand how many times in my career or with clients I was in places where that was the biggest downfall. Mm-hmm. So,
you've got a new product that you've invested millions of dollars into, And the sales guys go, well, why would I bother with this new risky product when it's so much easier to just do renewals and renewals and renewals? And the answer is the VP of sales should set up a compensation structure that encourages the right behavior. Alignment of objectives seems to be the place I've encountered the most of conflict that results in me feeling the need to manage up.
Yeah, I love that. What are the biggest mistakes people make when trying to manage up? Thoughts?
Well, I think
for me, go ahead, Steve.
I think some people said it earlier by saying understanding who you're communicating with. Who's the persona? What's their problem? What's their language? And so if I come in and I talk about technical debt to a sales team, I'm going to lose them instantly, right? So that's I think that's the biggest challenge is taking yourself out of it and saying, all right, what does this person's need to know?
Yeah, I love it.
I agree with that too. I think May said that as far as the audience, knowing the audience. So I agree 100%.
Awesome. See, I was going to say the biggest mistake I've seen is being overly making it about yourself, right? And I think this goes to the negative connotation Stacey talked about in the beginning, right? There are definitely people who the way they manage up comes across as a brown noser, suck up, who is only in it for themselves. I had a manager who the leadership team thought she was the greatest thing since sliced bread. She got all the star reviews. A1 was the code we used at GE. A top, exceeds all expectations, 1 immediately promotable. And her team, which happened for me to be that Foxhole team, Marlon, that I never have ever met another team like that. We all did amazing work and we all got B2s. And in 12 months, every single person left. And she was so climb the ladder focused that it was, I think that's where the negative connotation of managing up comes in. And so I'd say that's the biggest mistake.
I think one of the things that, let's listen to all the things that we're saying. We are all talking about individual responsibility for the person in that role. And I would like to also point to the fact that these challenges that we experience in these organizations are often deeply systemic. Yeah, we might have an issue with one person, but that one person is still there because of the systems around them, right? And it's never just one person when we're in a bad place.
No,
And
in
so,
that situation, it was a systemic culture that rewarded people like that.
exactly. So when we're talking about what can we do to make this better, not just for ourselves, but for our teams, what we're really talking about is building that product culture where we can do things better, even if it's a microcosm within a larger whatever it is that's beyond what you can control. But it's important to recognize, where you are, like going back to Marlon's idea of context. And context includes, what the humans in your organization, including the people above you, but also beside you and also below you, what do they actually do in all of these like strange situations that have no recipe?
Yeah.
May I'll add a little bit to that, and I think Grant, you forced me to actually make this statement, which is managing up requires, I don't know if it's managing down or ownership down. I don't know how you want to say it, or accountability down. And I hear that a lot in what May says. I think I picked up on it with Stacey too and Richard, which is if you want to have a different environment, it has to start with your senior leadership to foster that environment for those conversations to organically, happen, for the managing up to happen. When I was working at Brady, and I was one of a couple of multinationals I worked at, we had a saying: how much time, if you're in a management role, are you spending on the business versus in the business? And working on the business is figuring out what isn't working right to unclog all of those avenues for communication and creating a better environment. That is a part of working on the business and not being, mired down with working in the business if you're in a management or leadership role. So I'll add that piece.
I love that. Richard,
Yeah.
biggest mistakes.
Biggest mistake, assuming what someone needs to know is what they want to know.
That's a great one.
Right.
I mean, that's just a pull quote by itself.
Yeah, and it's so true, right? A senior leader doesn't need the details. As Marlon said, they need to know what can go wrong that they're going to get in trouble for when they're in front of the board before it happens, right? And if that's what you tell them and what they want is the details, well, you just missed the mark. Because
or a worse way of saying that is when they say, just tell me everything's okay. And you're like, oh, all right, well, everything's okay.
I find select details builds trust.
Mhm.
So
You do need details. You're going to be asked about details. you give that answer, but the next question is, well, what kind of countermeasures and what's happening? So you need to know details to explain that piece. So you do need some details.
I find that, like, if you're building trust, though, offering the right set of details in advance before they have to ask you is really critical to building that trust.
Getting ahead of it.
Yeah. So there's a bit of
But
finesse.
to Richard's point, you can't fix them not knowing what they need to know and having the alignment of what they need and what they want being two different things. Stacey, we'll finish. Biggest mistakes.
I don't know if I can add anything that anyone hasn't said. I think everyone has covered what I would have said.
Awesome. With that said, we're going to move to our wrap up. What's your biggest learning or takeaway from this conversation? And I'm going to start with Marlon. Biggest learning or takeaway?
I'm going to say biggest takeaway for anybody who's probably watching this video later or is watching it now is at a minimum, make sure you give a heads up to whomever is above you, beside you, so that they can not be surprised, so that they can continue to operate effectively. That's the minimum. So I see Steve wrote it in here in the private chat, which is, tell me about problems before I get yelled at, which is, I don't want any surprises. Give me a heads up. Tell me what the next step is. Give me what's happening next so that we're all in alignment and it makes this way on up. That's the minimum you could do.
Awesome. Stacey.
I love Richard's last comment around what someone assumes they need to know may not always be what they need to know. That's my takeaway that I'll be thinking about in future conversations. So thank you for that, Richard.
Awesome. Richard, takeaway, learning.
Probably what I need to have another conversation with May on it. Right. So I gave that comment, what do you need to know versus what do you want to know? And she brought on, maybe they feel they really need to know those details or some level of details. And so having some conversations with May is, how do I figure out what level of details may these different people actually want to know or feel like they need to know so that I can proactively share those.
Love that. May, biggest learning or takeaway?
I really like Stacey's comment about the term managing up implies some sort of bravado. And it does. Like, I never really thought about it from that lens. And I appreciate that, like, new angle of looking at it.
No, that's on my list as well. And I don't know, maybe there's another conversation there to be had. Steve, biggest learning or takeaway?
Well, I hadn't really realized it until this conversation, but I guess I have always thought of managing up as a conflict-based phrase. If I'm managing up, it's because they're idiots and I need to, manage them to be in a non-idiot state. And yet, I think the insights today are, tell me about problems before I get yelled at. Let's make sure the people above, below, and beside us are in the loop. For years, I've been advocating, clear visibility and aligned objectives. And I think if you've got those things, you don't need to manage up.
Completely and totally. I've got 4 things written down here. And, gosh, it's Stacey's comment on sort of the bravado and the negative context of the managing up. It's Marlon on the context of the foxhole and needing to know these things before you're surprised and needing to know what you have there. It's Richard on the need to know versus want to know, maybe not aligning. And then it's May on how often culture is the impact, right? A corporate culture is what. So I'm going to, since all the other 3 had sort of been said in this takeaways, I'm going to go with the corporate culture as my takeaway. That sometimes managing up is not ideal how we want it to be. Sometimes it's dictated by a corporate culture that we do not have control over. And I guess our decision then, back to Marlon and I talking about it earlier, is you may decide that if that's the culture and you can't change it, do you need to change the situation?
But it's not a culture that we don't have. It's a culture that we don't have control over, but it's often a culture we can influence.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in a position of power, because if you are the head of product, it is
You
your
should be able
job.
to. No.
That is your job.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I can completely and totally agree with that. And so, what a great conversation, Stacey. Thank you so much for coming on to your first panel. Hopefully, we can get you some more. You brought so much great insight and context and energy. We thank you, Marlon and Richard. Thank you so much, May and Steve. As always, what a great panel. Next week, we are off for the July 4th in the United States. Well, I guess it's July 4th and Canada Day week. So we are celebrating both of those with an international panel. And the week after that, we're going to do a conversation on problem statements. For those who were with us last week, Scott Selhorst was in the comments, and he's writing a book on problem statements. And we thought we'd have a great team. We had an amazing panel already lined up. So that'll be, in 2 weeks from now, we'll be doing that one. So look for it on LinkedIn. Everybody have a great Canada Day weekend, July 4th weekend, and we'll see everybody in LinkedIn in the next panel. Take care, everybody.